StreamYards.
We're live.
We are live.
No more shop talk.
And I don't see the button, by the way.
You don't see it? Okay. Welcome to Workshopping Personalization, where I want to revisit the problem of personalization at scale and why it irritates me so much. But this is also about the future of content. Joining me as my hugely valued BS detector is Thomas Wieberneit. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. And I'm looking forward to an exciting conversation.
It feels like I'm going back to the well again and again on this topic, but I just always have more to say, and it feels like the hype gets laid on thicker and thicker. By the way, if you are on LinkedIn, please comment at some point to let us know that you are following us. And if you're having trouble with the LinkedIn stream, which has been happening occasionally lately, we can send you a YouTube link. But I'd like to try to see if we can make LinkedIn work, since we're trying to have a community, not just be lonely YouTube outposts. So anyhow, this topic. So obviously there's a lot of hype around the role of AI and all of this, which we're going to get to. Personalization has been defined by Cognilytica as one of the 7 major patterns of AI, or hyper-personalization. For the purposes of our discussion today, I really don't want to have a lot of big semantics, but Thomas can be a stickler for definition. So how are we going to do this? So Thomas, my proposal for today, and today only for the next hour, you don't have to agree to this for the rest of your life. I want to use the word personalization to describe what's traditionally considered segmentation. So in other words, if you and I both go to a show in Orlando and we receive an email about like something happening in Orlando that's similar to what we went to, I consider that personalization. It's a segment. It's a classic thing. It's been done for a long time. Okay. Hyper-personalization, as I'm going to define it, is something that is created for me and me alone, usually done algorithmically, because it's not really possible to do that at scale. Otherwise, it's usually got AI plays some kind of a role. So for example, like you and I have talked in the past about YouTube and how impressed I are by their algorithm, but personalization on my YouTube, I see something different than anyone else. That's what I'm going to call hyper-personalization today. Whether it works or not, we're going to get into. But can we agree on those 2 definitions just for today?
Of course.
Excellent. Okay, cool. But we'll also agree that these are not set in stone for the future, just for today.
Oh, they will not be set in stone, because there are very creative marketers around.
Yes, indeed. And there's a lot of buzzwords unclaimed for 2025, despite my unpredictions with Brian Summer. And hyper-personalization is probably already getting long in the tooth, so we're probably going to get something new soon anyway.
Yeah, it's time.
Right. Okay. Well, that's how we're going to use the terms today. So one of the things that got this conversation going was around a piece that Barb Mosher-Zink wrote on Diginomica. She's our lead digital marketing writer. She wrote about, can AI really drive the success of email marketing? And I'm ultimately going to drive this conversation towards email, Thomas. And the reason for that is because I think email is a really great test of how good we are at this shit. And also how willing we are to spray and pray versus get it right. Because email's harder than like showing me a web page, right? Because like, for example, one of the reasons YouTube does well is because it shows me a bunch of stuff on the page. Like it's set up for that. It doesn't have to pick the one thing that it thinks I'm going to like. It shows me a bunch of stuff I might like. Yeah. Really hard to do that in email. Like email, you really need to pick your angle that you're going after. So I think it presents a higher bar for getting this right. So we're gonna end up in email. But do you see what I'm getting at there? Does that kind of make sense?
Makes sense. Yeah. And I think email is the perfect playground. I mean, it comes in various form factors, so to say, depending on the device you receive it on. And it is ubiquitous. And it's easy to ignore.
Right. So it's a good fertile testing ground for this. It's not by any means the only channel. I suppose you could label things like app notifications into that to some extent. But let's stick with email for today. When we get there. I also wanted to say that any of you who were invited by me, that was hyper-personalization. But that was not AI. That was me inviting you. So if you got an invite, I picked you specifically. I did not blast anyone like Thomas does. Just kidding, Thomas.
Did I boasted?
I sent you a personal invite. So I'd appreciate if you comment in the chat and say you're here, so that I know you're here. But anyhow, if you're watching on like Twitter, X, or YouTube, then I didn't do that. That's the algorithm at work. That's hyper-personalization at scale for you. Okay, so I want to pull back for a sec because a lot of this like passion for this topic comes down to, frankly, like the reason I'm still in this business, which is that I know how to create content, and it turns out that creating content matters. And so I'm pretty passionate about that. And I want to sort of, I have a lot at stake that it still matters, but hey, look, if it doesn't matter anymore, I can always try to busk on a street corner. So, I was kind of always like had that saving grace in my life that I was good at that. There's a lot of things I wasn't good at that I failed at. For example, I wanted to be a musician and turned out that I just wasn't good enough. So, there are things you're good at and things you're not. And so the fact that I spent my whole life doing it, I think gives me a pretty good angle on, evaluating what AI is good at as well. And so when I think about content, I first have this framework around the attention economy, right? So, and basically the concept behind that is that when brands in the B2B world that we're talking about create content, that ultimately they're competing with everything now. So it's not just like you're competing with like other work emails, like, a lot of people working from home, you're competing for attention with whatever. They might take a break and stream something on Netflix. They might get pings on their phone, but that, you're competing with Game of Thrones on a certain level. Like there's other stuff out there. But the good news that I have noted for B2B brands is that you don't have to do this on like a pure entertainment level. You can compete on what I call relevance instead. And relevance is like, can you give me information that matters to me now? But ultimately, the vision behind it for me is this vision of opt-in communities, that content hopefully leads to community, which leads to engagement, which leads to happy prospects, happy customers, and brand credibility. And one of the interesting distinctions around B2B content is trust. So for example, like last night before I went to bed, I was watching Banshee again, which is one of my favorite kind of trash shows. It's a pretty good show actually, but I don't need to trust HBO Max. I don't need to trust in that show. It's just an entertainment factor alone. But the beauty in a B2B context and the importance of it is that trust was always a huge part of it, and kind of extending relationships. And Thomas, I don't know if you noticed this at all in your content, but when I first started doing this in the late 90s and stuff and writing content, what fascinated me was how I was able to build virtual trust with people that I had never met. And then eventually we would meet, and it was like we had a basis for a relationship that was built on that content and also on the interactions maybe we had on social channels around it. I was fascinated by that feeling of how we had forged a connection, first through content. And so that's when I first started realizing trust is a really big deal. And I'm here to argue today that it's an even bigger deal for brands in the age of AI, which is not to say they would never use AI for content ever, but that trust is going to be a really important part of why content matters. What do you think?
Yes. So
all right.
that basically sums it up. I'm just thinking in circles a little around this. So ultimately, if it comes to evolving a business relationship, this evolves only via trust. What I'm not so sure about is the initial establishment of contact, which seems to have morphed to some extent. So if I'm looking at LinkedIn right now, or Facebook for that matter, which turns out to be a business relationship initiation engine as well, meanwhile, or Instagram even TikTok. Yeah. What I do see a lot is what I often call soul striptease. So there is some more or less business irrelevant content that shall likely shall convey a sense of authenticity, which, as I consider that striptease, doesn't jibe too well with me, but it seems to jibe with with people who are different than me. Maybe I'm just off.
Could you provide like an example of what you're talking about with striptease? Because I think I know, but can you, not without naming names?
Well, there's an example very close to me, next room, basically. She does quite some interesting posts, which are more or less relevant to an audience, but that mixes, well, in my eyes, often stuff that shouldn't go there, just doesn't belong there. So is this now because of ultimately business is human or humanizing business, or is that to show some, hey, I'm a real person, still I know my stuff? I don't know whether this is the right way. Okay, I'm 50, I'm approaching 58. Maybe I'm just too old for that stuff. But
okay, so you hit on something interesting, which is this notion of like relatability and also that feeling of being accessible. I think has started to really matter with content. So, for example, like when people read my stuff or read your stuff, I think it has an impact knowing that they can reach out to you and message you and you'll respond, or if they comment and ask you a question, you'll respond. So I think that's important. But I want to hone in a little bit on this trust thing, because I think ultimately, like, trust in an enterprise context should tie back to the topics that you want people to perceive you as having something to say on or being relevant on. So, like, you might post something authentic about your personal life, but ultimately it's your CRM Konvos brand and all the conversations you foster around that content that make me trust you as someone who I would invite onto the show to talk about these issues, because you understand these issues. So I think what you're talking about, we could debate whether or not it works to have that humanizing content, but I think ultimately you have to back up stuff with so-called topic authority. And the phrase thought leadership is a tired, hackneyed phrase. But if you look at books on how to do it, they still talk about all these classic things like writing books, speaking, all this stuff that creates the perception of authority around what you do. And I would argue that all of that still matters. And even though a lot of the content that we consume today is snackable, and a lot of times if you write a book, people won't necessarily read it, they're still more likely to invite you to speak, to engage, blah, blah, blah. And so I still think that has a lot of deep relevance to this conversation. Now, one thing I'm going to be writing about, hopefully in the new year, was a conversation I had with the CRM Players guys, Paul and Brent, around video, where I started to sort of reframe this whole concept of relevance, that you can be entertaining and relevant as well. I was trying to sort of diminish the entertainment thing, because I think brands make a lot of mistakes over-investing in highly produced, like, splashy content that, Super Bowl ads or whatever, when I think they need to focus more on sort of this sort of like that continued sharing really good, like, content stuff. I mean, so, when I see brands, for example, advertise splashy Super Bowl ads, but then they go out and they also put together like training courses that are free, I'm more impressed with the training courses, because that showcases their internal experts. And I'm actually referring to a real brand, but I'm not going to say their name. But if you do your research, you can, in my articles, you can figure out who I'm talking about. But the point is, like, that this whole notion around like creating that deeply relevant content, but it can be, there is an entertainment factor. I just think it's a little bit different than how brands perceive entertainment. Because I think when brands think about entertainment, they do think about competing with these big TV shows and doing splashy stuff. And so much, I think, around B2B entertainment is this raw, jugular feeling of live, unscripted discussions. And especially ones that include you. That's not the only kind of B2B content, of course. But I think, like, so for example, like when I'm talking with vendors around like webinars and stuff, I'm always like trying to coax them into like, can we do this live? Can we take questions live? Can we create more of a dynamic, unscripted feeling? Can we do less rehearsing? Can we do less scripted remarks? Can we bring these discussions that people feel a part of into the forefront? And so to me, what I started to realize is, and I'm going to write about this, is that is a form of entertainment, but it's a form of entertainment in the sense that you have a connection to it. You want to be there. You don't want to miss it. You don't just want to maybe watch it on replay later, you know?
But edutainment to some extent. But let's check with the example of Super Bowl ads. So there are two different layers or different intentions also. If you're doing the training courses, this clearly has the intention less of exposing and exhibiting your own expertise, but this is about increasing your reach, enabling people using your toolkits, your software, your whatever. Yeah. The Super Bowl ad has one and only one reason. It's becoming known. It's brand awareness.
Yeah.
So it has its, let's say, its right of existence in its own right.
Sure, absolutely.
One mustn't mix the purposes.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I kind of use it. I'm not even saying that the brand should never do it or anything like that. It's just more that it encapsulates what I see as a problem, which is always shifting towards throwing production budgets at content as opposed to thinking about a more organic approach of leveraging your own experts in creative formats around topics that you want to build trust around. And I think one of the reasons this happens is that a lot of marketing teams simply don't have a lot of journalistic expertise around the creation of content. But here's the good news. There's a lot of underemployed journalists out there who can help you with that problem, and they are available. So if you have the humility to accept that problem, there are people out there. So anyway, so one of the reasons I wanted to go into this was I'm kind of building up into this AI hyper-personalization thing, and we're getting there. But so there's this other thing around AI and content generation, which is like, I want to separate out like things like using AIs to create help documentation based on quality training materials and good data. Like, we all understand that AI can do stuff like that. I thought it was super interesting on your last show that I crashed on AI, where you asked Andreas, like, flat out, like, did he use AI to write his book? And I thought his answer I thought was really revealing, because here's someone who plays with these tools all the time, and he even had a AI neon sign behind him in the background during the show. So it's logical to ask him, did AI help you write the book? Do you want to tell the audience what he said?
Yeah, he answered in one word, basically, and then extended on it. 2 letters, no.
But the interesting thing was why, right?
The long version is why? Because it's his thoughts, his revelations, his argumentation, and this can't be created by some artificial entity. So that is important. This is an extremely important statement. I mean, also from a quality point of view, I usually say that when you're going the AI route for doing this or creating content, you're ending up in instant mediocrity. It's fairly
with a nod to Hyen Park, who originally blogged about that phrase in a classic blog. Do a search for Amalgam Insights, Instant Mediocrity, and read that.
Okay,
he wrote it about 2 years ago.
I don't claim copyright.
No. I'm just saying for readers who find that phrase intriguing, I would encourage you to read that post. It's really good. Anyway.
Yeah. And so it's what we create so far, and I'm quite optimistic that things will change in the next few years. But so far, we are just creating a huge amalgam, an average. So there are no outliers in either direction from a quality of writing. So, well, there may be outliers in the direction that you don't want to go, but there is an extremely low likelihood that what comes out of these AI systems that we have right now is extremely good.
Right. And Tracy, I just want to say hello. Welcome to the show. TGIF, you received a hyper-personalized invite from me because you're one of my favorite participants, so please feel free to chime in. This was very much a seat of the pants conversation, but one I was really looking forward to having.
The challenge with this type of invitation, of course, is it doesn't scale.
It does not scale. Of course it doesn't. But I thought it would be too ironical to blast my thousands of contacts or whatever with something on hyper-personalization, so I refused to do that. But anyhow, just getting back to this, I think like this mediocre content thing is an interesting point, because I think one of the things that makes the content mediocre, in my opinion, is that it's not just excellence of reading, it's the human element. So for example, I interviewed someone on my show a while back whose blogs I used to share a lot of my weekly curation. And this person said on my show, I'm not going to call them out, but they said that they now use AI to generate the blogs for their site. Well, I haven't shared one of his posts in my weekly curations since then. And it's not that the content is bad, because it's a lot of lessons on enterprise projects, and the lessons are all still there, because he's generated it on an archive of quality material around that topic. So the content's there, Thomas. It's interesting. So in a way, it's not mediocre in the sense that it's all there, but I can't find his point of view. I can't find his opinions. I can't find like why it matters. I'm missing the personal touches of this, in the middle of the post, this resonates with me based on a particular project I was just on. Mm-hmm. Like I can't connect to it. So I think it's really interesting that what we define as mediocre or engaging, like, is a really interesting part of this. And I'm
make it mediocre.
What's that?
It doesn't make this. Isn't this the very definition of mediocre? It doesn't resonate.
Right. But I think it's interesting as why, because it's actually still got the content. The lessons, the project lessons are just as good, really. It's just I can't connect.
Hey, what happened? What happened?
Hello.
There I am again. So
hello. Context matters. Yeah. Please elaborate on that point. And Tracy, can you repost your last comment? Because I had an internet glitch. Sorry about that. Tracy, I missed your second longer comment. If you can repost it, that'd be great. Unless, Thomas, did you see what she wrote?
No.
Okay.
I stared into my face.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that, Tracy. Can you repost that comment, please? Thank you. And Ardeth, can you elaborate on the context, because I think you're getting at something important there. So yes, the definition of mediocrity is really interesting, and I think it's interesting how here we go. Tracy says, I just love the messages that say, hello, Tracy, do you need help building a recruiting service, process, or solution? LOL. Read nothing about me. Yeah, exactly. We're going to get back to spray and pray because we're building up to the hyper-personalization discussion here. So we will get to that. So anyway, I think things are coming to a head a little bit in certain ways. Like I got an email the other day, John, how would you like to turbo your podcast with AI and put out hundreds of podcasts next year and monetize and all this stuff? And I actually said, like, bring it on with all your AI generated crap podcasts. Like, flood the market with that crap if you want. Like, I'm going to double down on something different. Of course, the danger is that things get so noisy that it's impossible to overcome. But I would like to believe that through that community of connections that we build around what we do, that we can still like break through. But I find it fascinating how like it gives me something to compete against, actually, because at some point when things get too easy to produce at scale, then it does create an opening for people who are willing to do the hard work of doing something different. And, like Diginomica, for example, we were the first publication that I know of to say we're not using any AI assist in any of our articles, like not for the writing at all. And, a lot of publishers didn't want to do that because they wanted to make statements like, oh, we're going to look at the pros and cons of this and we're going to be open to how it evolves and stuff like that. And we were like, no, we have to draw a line in the sand now because reader trust is paramount to us. The Financial Times put out something on that fairly soon after, similar thing. And then the Newsstack down the line published something along those lines. And those are the only three. I thought the Newsstack was kind of significant because they tend to be a fairly pro-AI publication. But anyway, so I think it's interesting because it doesn't necessarily, when we took that stance, it doesn't necessarily mean that AI couldn't occasionally provide assistance on a story and it would be a good article. It just means that we had a different bar for reader trust we wanted to maintain. And so I think it's an interesting thing from a brand perspective because I think it gets back to your point around mediocrity. Like that's a great way to head down the road to mediocrity as we were discussing it.
Yeah. And there are good ways of using it, by the way. But you need to start with chunks of content and then use the intelligence to recombine them at scale, depending on who you talk to. But it's not about writing the content. I think it's about the journey more than the creation of images or texts or clips, meanwhile.
Ardas says, I couldn't relate to the training because there wasn't any context that linked it to something I care about. And that's what I found really interesting is that I actually do really care about the topics, but I still can't connect to it, even though the content is fairly good and also it passes sort of the relevance test. And then I think you nailed it here. Nothing brought it to life for you. I think that was part of it. There was nothing I could attach to. Like, it's just an interesting thing because I wasn't expecting that. But I just don't like the articles. I don't share them because I know it's not because I'm not being a snob and saying I'm not sharing his AI generated content. I just can't share something that I can't connect to that I wonder if other readers will. Tracy says, hilarious how hyper-personalization is doing the opposite. It might have worked before everyone knew that the tokens is faking engagement and empathy. Just like the auto dialer that is a robot, they kept calling me over and over and you can't ask to be removed. So I start yelling at the robot, stop spam, remove me, stop. And the robot says, we'll remove you from the list. Well, Tracy, I think that's a terrible example of hyper-personalization. And thank you for continuing to drive us towards my ultimate goal for this conversation. But anyway, I think it's really interesting because it becomes this question of, to what extent, like you said, Thomas, are other consumers like me? To what extent are B2B decision makers like you and me? Or to what extent would they accept a lower bar of content? And if the content bar is lower, then I think we're lost in an AI noise machine, and I'm not sure we can escape. And this is something that I do worry about because I've seen the movie Idiocracy a couple of times. And there's a point at which if people start thinking like if all that they consume is mediocre, then everything I have to say about it being exceptional, like I might as well just give up and quit and go home because it doesn't matter. So I think that's a really interesting thing. And I can't claim to know the answer to that. But at the moment, my feeling is that it's going to be possible for brands and individuals to compete against that instant mediocrity and stay the course. But I think it's going to be fascinating because it's certainly going to be possible to create a lot of mediocre stuff and put it out there. And to what extent will that be viable? I don't know. And where this gets interesting from a hyper-personalization discussion is, will that be another way to make mediocre content better? So in other words, if I write something generically mediocre, you're probably not going to like it. But what if it's hyper-personalized to you? Will you like it enough? like because it's got details that are relevant to you. So I think that right now, I don't think hyper-personalization is doing that, but that's what I kind of find interesting. Can hyper-personalized AI compensate for mediocre content? I don't know the answer to that, but
I'd say in theory, well, let's put a precursor to it. It's like communism, yeah. In theory, it's great. In theory, it works.
Yes.
In practice, it's boiling down to some extent to how we are socialized in terms of what we have experienced in the past, and hence what we expect in the future. So now there comes this hyper-personalized email to me, which instantly creates a reaction in me that says, okay, they want more share of my wallet. They don't want anything good from me. I mean, Christmas is approaching. The cyber weekend just happened. They just want to make a sale. They couldn't care less about my needs and wants. So this is the instant reaction that I'm trained to have out of my experience. So the way to make it work is very likely stepping back a little, finding out why does this guy react like this? And I hope I'm not the only one. So if there's a critical mass, then they need to step back and think, heck, what did we do wrong? And why do people react like that? And then what can I change? So that when I reach out, Thomas reacts in a way, hey, here's someone who genuinely wants to help me. And this is in a consumer world, the same as it's even worse in the business world. I mean, we have seen a couple of examples just right now of how we are getting approached in a way that is not so hyper-personalized. And this, the whole thing is, well, that's the linear thinking of efficiency. I think this is the problem. It's just making it easier to scatter more, which creates more noise, which, by the way, makes it harder to find the diginomica signal. Because diginomica is a signal.
Yeah, I have noticed, and it does create. Look, I'm not going to lie that I have a dog in this fight. It should be pretty obvious by now that I do. But I also have worked really hard to get to a point in my life where I feel I can be pretty ruthless about analyzing it anyway and saying, look, I might lose this one. And that could be the case. And if I lose this one, though, I don't want to lose it to bullshit content that people think is good. I'd rather lose it because AI actually creates something meaningful and useful, which gets us to Tracy's point. My Gen Z son hates AI for content and art. Instead of using robots for drudgery so we humans can be creative, we are having robots do creative so we can all read regurgitated info. Yeah, a couple things there, Tracy. I think one interesting thing there is I think a lot of artists are going to use AI in some of the context of their work. That's always been the case. Creative artists using technology in really cool ways, and that I have no problem with. But at the moment, to this point, big AI has strip mined the intellectual property of artists with no legitimate compensation, and it's borderline tragic, I think, to a lot of working artists. But I did want to point out to you, Tracy, that one of the reasons why we're getting such a raw deal is because the robotics for drudgery thing is actually quite a difficult technical problem. And at the moment, robots only work in very controlled settings, like certain kinds of warehouses. And like building a robot for the home, believe me, if it was technically possible, that would be happening. Like it's not like companies are opposed to getting robots to do drudgery for you. It's just that homes are a very high-risk environment with unpredictable scenarios, and robots aren't there yet. Someday you probably will have a robot assistant to do a lot of your drudgery at home, but for now we have things like robots going into highly toxic zones and doing things humans can't do there, or you have your little, harmless little vacuum cleaner thing that your cat can play around with without being hurt. But the drudgery stuff I think will come. There's just actually a lot of technical barriers to that. So,
and these robots, the vacuums, are Well, an easy entryway for exactly that.
It's a start. It's a start.
Simple test beds, yeah. Simple test beds.
It's a start. And I think a lot of it is about getting people culturally used to living with machines. And so, like we have a robot at our grocery center that's practically useless. It does nothing except look for spills, but it gets people used to the idea that there would be a robot wandering around. But even that robot almost crashes into carts like every time I see it. And, we're just not very far with physical robotics. Sorry, AI hypesters. Brent says AI content isn't king, but AI filters could be. Well, Brent, I wouldn't mind you elaborating on that, but I do think there's a more rudimentary form of AI around algorithmic AI that has been dictating content consumption and creating content issues for a long time. And what I have told people again and again is that we're not living in a content meritocracy, and the stuff you see on your feed is not necessarily the best stuff. So, for example, like with Thomas's blog, how do I know when Thomas has put out a blog? I don't want to leave that to the social feed. I subscribe to your blog. It's in my newsreader, and it's high up in my 1,000 feeds. I'm not going to tell you how high up because I don't want it to go to your head. But it's up there, so I'm going to see it every week because I know that my social feeds are not good enough at surfacing that because they're going to have a bunch of crap in there about, oh, I love my team. We just had the best offsite, and oh my God, I was blown away by the delivery of the food, and I was so grateful for my teammates, and that's my LinkedIn feed all day long. So I don't see your post in LinkedIn. So I got to go. I mean, sometimes I do, but I got to I'm not going to leave that to chance. But unfortunately, that's our social networks right now.
Makes me happy enough that I'm appearing in your RSS at all. So before we go to Tracy, I think the comment of Brent, if I understand it correctly, is a bit too short, actually. So it's not that the AI that does the filtering and the sorting is king, but the guy who owns this AI.
Absolutely.
That is the king.
The aggregators, they've been winning for a while. Yeah. Absolutely. And they still win.
Yeah, the man in the middle.
They still win.
Or the one with the shovel. Or the one with the
Tracy says, I read a LinkedIn profile that made reference to Michael Scott from The Office, a pair of Jordans, and she used AI to make an image of Michael Scott wearing Jordans. It was hilarious. And I'm no artist. I thought it was fun. And yeah, and look, I mean, there's going to be a lot of experimentation and self-generated content has been a part of social media feeds for a long time now, and will continue to be in various ways. And I know some Diginomica folks have used AI for images. I don't, because I'm really waiting on an AI image service that like aggressively funds creators. So I'm waiting on that, but that's just, I'm a stickler for that. But yeah, and one of the cool things is you can, sometimes get exactly the image you want, and that can be fun. And I'm not necessarily opposed to any of that, but I think it does take us away a little bit from what I wanted to get to today, which is this notion of hyper-personalization. I want to get back to this. So I think hyper-personalization is technically feasible, objective, if you will, Thomas. Like, in other words, if I'm a company and I own 100,000 email addresses, it's technically feasible for me to send a different email now to each person potentially. And if it's not technically feasible today, it will be quite soon. That's right there. Now, whether that's cost effective from a generative standpoint is a different question. But technically, the obstacle to doing that it's gone. It can be done, right? Would you accept that premise?
Yeah, fully agree. Okay. That's the main difference between one-to-one marketing and hyper-personalization.
Yes. So, but the interesting thing about that to me, before we get into it further, is let's say a brand does that, fine. But if they do that and they also insist on continuing to send me spray and pray emails of the traditional variety because it's affordable and a certain percentage of people sign up, then I think they've undermined their own hyper-personalization strategy to me, right? Because now it's dissonant. Sometimes I get a super personal message, and let's put aside for a sec whether it really works well or not, but sometimes I get that hyper-personalized message, And sometimes I get your traditional spray and pray. Like let's see, I just got one today from a hotel chain or whatever that should know better. They know I've never traveled there over the holidays, but they insist on sending it anyway, right? Why? Because it's cheap and they can spray and pray and they don't care. And my argument in a B2B context is that that's not good enough. And so this is one of the fundamental problems I see, is that even if it works, our brand's going to be able to resist stopping all the going fishing things. I'm skeptical that they will, and therefore their hyper-personalization strategy is like pretty suspect, because it gets back to the things Tracy was saying about these disingenuous conversations that don't feel real.
There we are back to the topic of journeys. I think there needs to be a hybrid strategy. So you can't, even if it's economically feasible, or if it would be economically feasible, there's no need to hyper-personalize everything. There is, like with the Super Bowl example, there are things that are very likely of general interest for you. How does company A, B, Z go on? And what are their next announcements to be? What do they think is currently important? This is one thing. This is the newsletter stuff. You subscribe to some interest, and as long as it's in these interests, it's personalized enough. Now you're in the journey of researching something. Then it's time to become very individual, become hyper, so to say.
Yes.
Then it's about providing you with in-moment information, be it via email or via website, right now. And the right information.
Tracy knows a tool that can do it. So Tracy's validating that it's technically possible. It isn't 100% those, so it's super risky. Thanks for flagging that, Tracy. And I think that's one of the interesting flaws in the hyper-personalization model, is that when it goes wrong, it can go very wrong, right? So like if someone sends me a spray and pray, I know that they're like just screwing around. But if they mess a hyper-personalized email up and they get some of the details wrong, that's just like, that's a real turnoff. Thomas, I think you're right about this opt-in thing. And this is kind of why I've kept coming back to this notion of opt-in communities, and why I think opt-in is still the future, even though brands hate this because they want the AI to just make decisions without securing the opt-in. But I think the opt-in is sort of what makes my inbox work. And when I receive stuff that I've opted into, then I have no problems, even if it's not always perfect for me. I know that the brands are trying to deliver what I asked for. The problem is that they can't seem to stay on track. They take that opt-in and run with it and start sending me all this crap that I don't want or need or didn't ask for. And I think what's really interesting from an AI perspective around personalization is around the user interface level. So do you remember like in the past where you would be like in the back end of like a site like TechTarget, and you wanted to get like some cool emails on certain topics? And so you checked out all these boxes on this huge grid, and then you had like 3 different newsletters they would send you. Well, to me, like the cool thing about AI would be to interact with the user and say, hey, what topics are you most interested in? This, and this. Cool. What's your favorite format to receive that information in? Blah, blah, blah. How often a week would you like it? Blah, blah, blah. If I could do that for Diginomica today, I would, because that gives the user almost a total control over exactly what topics they want, when they want it, and how they want it. But AI people don't like this because they want the all-powerful AI to be smart enough to sense the context of my individual moment and send me exactly what I need auto-magically. So they don't want to do that hard work and humble themselves to that. But I think that's a better solution. And if I had the technology to do that today, I would put it on our website tomorrow.
It is, but and I think the problem is even another one. So it's not the AI people in terms of AI vendors on this side. It's the owners of this, let's call them the owners of the sites for lack of a better term.
I'm a site owner. Okay.
Yeah, well, present company excluded.
Okay.
What they want is basically they want to ingest as much of my data as possible, of my interests as possible, and then do not only want to push me their newsletter. No, what they are doing is with this opt-in or non-opt-in is, well, you realize it when you get newsletters from someone who you have never heard of. So basically, when they do that, they are cutting themselves off a revenue stream that they call legitimate interest.
Yes.
They need to use a GDPR term, which is utter, well, smelly stuff. But so the way you suggested is a good step into the right way. Because you could top it off one more step by saying, hey, Thomas, I've seen you browsing on our site now for a couple of times using first-party cookies, by the way, not third-party.
Yep.
And I've seen you have shown a particular interest in this, that, and whatnot. How about we proactively supply you with this information? What would you think about this, Thomas? Then I actually might react. In a positive way.
Brian, my Unpredictions co-author, if you haven't checked our annual Unpredictions, please do. I can't remember if we took a shot at hyper-personalization this year. Wait, can you guys pause for a minute while I load my AI Johnny RP into my email and LinkedIn stream? Brian, you probably got a hyper-personalized email from me today. So you're one of the few, man.
And he's here.
Yeah. And I got you here too. So how about that? Welcome to the show. So yeah, I think we've actually got a fairly far today. There's a couple of things I want to kind of cap this off with, and I'd love to get a few more observations from the audience. And thank you for chiming in. You've been incredibly useful today in advancing this discussion. So does hyper-personalization in an email context, have you ever seen it work, Thomas? I asked you this last time. Have you since gotten an example where it actually worked?
No, but that is probably because I very rarely opt into cookies. So when I see this cookie pop up, the first thing I make sure of, if possible, not all make it possible, is that whatever's non-necessary is deselected. Simple as. So that makes me a not so likely target of something that's really personalized.
Right.
But as said before, at the moment I can have the impression that they have my interest at the heart of their interest, means treating their success as a consequence of making me successful, then happy to say yes. And then it might work.
Brian says, let's talk about the marriage of these technologies with bad websites and poor customer service personnel.
Ouch.
If you're having issues with the vendor order, etc., none of these technologies will give you a reasonable positive experience. Brian, I think you're alluding to something that's really important here, because underneath all of this is this fantasy that AI can save us from our technical quagmire and the bad decisions we made in the past. And I'm here to make the argument that enterprise AI is only going to be really effective for companies that have already done a lot of the right heavy lifting already, in which case I think then it can be very effective. I think if you don't have that, I don't think you succeed. So in the case of content, my point would be you still have to build your opt-in community. Then you can look at how you can apply some AI around that. But the hard work of building an opt-in community, which by the way requires great relevant content, is still part of the game. And I know that marketers don't want to hear this. I know you don't want to do the hard work of creating authentic, meaningful experiences for people. But as I said, there's some available resources out there. And I'm not talking about people on this channel. I'm talking about out of work journalists and everything else that are here for you that know how to do this. And there's no excuse not to embrace this. And I had an argument with the vendor recently where I was like, it's hard work for a reason. It's hard work because it works. There's this fantasy that we can get out of this now. And I'm just saying that we can't. And I think Brian's point applies to that same principle. Sam Gupta, Thomas might not be the best buyer for email hyper-personalization. It has to be his wife. The point is it matters a lot more in B2C verticals. I think to some degree that's true. I mean, I think like relationship building in a B2B context is different because, Thomas, as you alluded to, I think what it needs to be is more of a gradual exchange of value, like where you start with some opt-ins, then you send someone something else that makes a difference for them. Maybe eventually you get them to an event. The momentum starts to build over time, as does the trust. B2C, Sam, I think is a pretty different environment, and I intentionally kind of said that the B2C is a little bit out of scope of this conversation today. I think those are different considerations, but one thing I would say in B2C is that I think there's a pretty blatant disregard for the minority of people who are disillusioned by brands for overreach on these tactics, and I think maybe they can get away with that in mass markets. I don't think you can get away with the disillusionment factor in B2B as easily, because sometimes the people you disillusion turn out to be the key players in the next software decision that you're trying to influence. So I think that's why I would frame it a little bit differently in B2B. Not to say that I agree with the collateral damage that B2C companies are necessarily willing to endure, but I do think they can get away with it more easily at that scale. So it is a different conversation.
And they are causing it for B2B as well. Well, look at everybody and their dog quote statistics, whether they are right or wrong, that 2/3 of the buyer's journey, B2B buyer's journey, is done before the buyer actually contacts a seller, means a salesperson. Yeah. So why is that? Surely not because all salespersons are sort of creepy persons and don't have a clue of what they are doing. There must be another reason. And this is, I think, trust. Because where do they inform themselves? They inform themselves in communities. These communities need to be informed via trustworthy persons with good content, relevant to the individuals at a certain point in time.
Yes.
And that's, by the way, why I think that especially in B2B, very personalized email marketing is probably not the right strategy.
Oh my God, you just destroyed about 50 slide decks for 2025, man.
Sorry for that.
Oh man, talk about coal in the marketer's Christmas stocking. Oh my God. Ouch. Brian says, expecting great outcomes because of hyper-personalization is a dubious goal. Why? The best outcomes come when people talk with other people to learn not just the needed function features, but to read the customer, find out what emotional, aspirational needs are out there. Hyper-personalization can't close that gap for now. I would tend to agree, Brian, and I would say that hyper-personalization is overrated in general as something that AI is ready for prime time at the moment, especially when it comes to things like email or any time where you have to pick one thing that you think that person cares about. And it's just very difficult because people are moving targets. Our preferences change on a dime. Our priorities change on a dime. It's really, really, really difficult. And one of the reasons why I have extolled the virtues of the YouTube algorithm so much in these past shows is because I think it's a terrific example of exactly the limits of the technology and how perfectly it can work when it works well, which is it shows me a bunch of stuff and it's just so good at giving me a range of stuff that connects to past, previous, and potential future interests, and it engages me. But that's different than if YouTube had to send me an email and pick one video that I'm going to watch, it's going to fail. And so I think a lot of it depends on that context. I'm told that the TikTok algorithm is even better, but I'm not in a position to speak to TikTok because I'm not on TikTok. And as I told Eric Kimberling, I'm rooting against you on TikTok because if I have to be a presence on TikTok to be successful in this business, then I'm out.
Good night.
I'm out. I'm gone. I don't know about you, Thomas, but I'm not doing
on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok.
I might do Blue Sky. I'm thinking about Blue Sky, but I'm not doing TikTok. Brian says I've had personalized emails that address me as Brain. I like Brain, actually, man.
Brain, yeah.
Brain's my favorite. Brian.
A Freudian,
hey, man, maybe they know something you don't, man. if they can't even get your name right, what else will they screw up? No soup for you. Well, right. And that's the real downside to this, right? Is that when you have that overreach, it starts to make you feel like, who am I in business with? And then there's that whole thing around like that creepy factor where you do have good information on someone. How far do you take it, right? So so for example, let's say that a brand knows that I'm in New York City for an event. If it sends me something that says like, hey, John, welcome to New York City, and I have reason to be comfortable with the fact that they know that. Here's a bunch of half off restaurant coupons, maybe you'll enjoy, or something like that. That might be okay. But what if I get a message that says, hey, John, it's kind of late at night and you haven't eaten yet. You must be hungry, lonely in your hotel room. Like, would you like a half off on your pizza? I'm like, wait, how do you know that? Like that's got a creepy factor, right? And so if we do figure out how to get this right, that's one of the really big things is how to get that just enough, right? That makes me feel like, hey, this is relevant, but not to the point where, you're saying, hey, you look kind of lonely in your hotel room. Would you like some pizza? I'm like, what the fuck?
Let's stick a bit less.
Brent says he's not on TikTok. Woohoo. All right. The anti-TikTok constituents are going, hey, Brent, do you have a show? Do you have your show at 5 today? Let us know. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Brian, yes, is not on Facebook. Well, Brian, you're missing out on a lot of hyper local action, dude. Sorry to tell you.
Yeah, lots of fun stuff going on there. Lots of memes. Let's revisit B2B and hyper-personalized with that word. Hyper-personalization.
Yes. Which we defined, by the way, an hour ago, in case anyone is wondering.
I still struggle with it.
Yeah.
Let's look at an ABM setting, account-based marketing, account-based selling. So there you learn as a vendor, you learn about what the potential buyer is interested in on the journey. And you learn about the various stakeholders in this buying center over time. And you have a bunch of good content. Maybe good content. Well, let's assume it's good content. And it's fairly granular. Like, I think it was a Mindshift back in 10, 15 years ago, who had quite a good system without the personalization aspects, but the ability to recombine small chunks of content.
Right.
Or an audience for a specific audience. Now, think that one step further. This specific audience can be a hyper-imposition at scale.
Hyper-imposition at scale from Brent Leary. Brian Summer, if you're out there, make a note of that for next year's predictions buzzwords. I think that one's going to make... I'm going to write it down too, Brent. You got it, man. Actually, let me see if I can give you the door prize. I'll try to find this for you. Do I have an applause button? I know I do somewhere. Anyway, go on, Thomas.
So there you have different stakeholders with different interests working towards the same goal. Different interests and different challenges for the same goal. Now assume you have the chunks of content that you can recombine in a way that they are speak to John, Brian, or Thomas and address their individual needs arising out of the corporate need. That would work. On the website as well as an email probably, because their email starts to become very feasible and makes vendor relevant. Now time for
Brent, here you go. Hyper-imposition at scale. You nailed it, dude. Yeah, I think so, Thomas. And I think part of this is like recognizing and this gets back to Tracy's comment around why don't we have robots to do the drudgery instead of doing the creative things that we want to do anyway. And I think a lot of this comes down to what the tools are good for and rejecting the narrative that we're going to just allow the tools to do whatever someone in some room says they can do. And like I said, if you have, for example, opt-in relationships in a thriving community, and if we have what you described, which is an ABM setup with a bunch of content that fits into different roles and characteristics and different points in a so-called customer life cycle, so you have all that, and you're generating interesting content from your so-called internal thought leaders, and maybe you're having external experts contribute at times as well. So you have a lot of content engine, it's rolling. Then you have what I described. What if you had an AI bot that asked people like, hey, how often do you want this? What topics do you prefer? What format do you want them in? All that stuff. Take away the guesswork, ask the user the question, because that's engage the bot. And then if my preference change, what if instead of just clicking on an unsubscribe link and trying to figure out how to unsubscribe from one thing while keeping the other things and all of that mess, like, why not just go back to the bot and say, hey, can you stop sending me as much content on, whatever, like, on, Cloud ERP, because I've made a decision there, but I still want to have your content on customer experience. Like, okay, the bot says, yeah, well, we'll change that and blah, blah, blah. Like, wouldn't that be cool if it could just constantly adapt to your preferences? Like, to me, that's a fantastic use case for AI. But no, because it's not hyper-personalized. You're asking the user to give you information. Well, that's the whole point, is that you don't know what your users want. You have to ask them.
It's a way to personalize it, even to hyper-personalize it, or ultra-personalize it.
I mean, don't you think that would be an interesting interface to a back-end system like the one you described? And then the quote-unquote AI system agentically could also distribute that content based on the cadence that was agreed upon. And then the user can reinitiate at any point and say, actually, my preferences have changed. Here's what I want. And the bot says, no problem. And it might even like restate for you what you're going to get. And then on you go. No more toiling in the back end of preferences engines, like checking certain boxes on and off, like just fix it for me and it's done. That is totally doable.
And this consent-based thingy is something that companies like Gigi are, well, I still have their old name. I don't name the new name. Based on. Start with the freaking consent and don't assume.
Right.
Don't grab and buy data, because that's the real valuable data. They are in quite significant test statistics and studies on that. The relevant data for them as the ones who feed information or to me is the information that I gave willingly. It's bogus anyways if I don't give it willingly.
Yes.
Please assume it's bogus if you just ask me for some email address and some statistical data for your crappy white paper. The heck you get my data.
There you go.
Doesn't it?
Brian says, after Brent's hyper-imposition at scale will come the hyper-inquisition at scale. So, Brian, that's an interesting one, because I'd be curious to see if you can scale that, because I've seen your hyper-inquisitions on display at many events. If you can scale that, let us know how that will be done, perhaps via avatars, and maybe we can call upon the metaverse for this. I don't know.
Needs the Brian clone. Or the brain clone.
Paging Ray Wong.
Yeah.
Paging Ray Wong.
Yeah.
That's Brian. That's one technical hurdle I'm not going to be able to clear today, but I like your thinking there. So I think we're heading towards a wrap. It's a topic we can't completely solve, but one, just to kind of revise. Any of you have some final comments? I would love to hear them. Thanks so many of you for joining the chat. Sam, you came on strong towards the end. Feel free to chime in a little bit further. So one of the things we agreed upon is that email is sort of a really potent, sort of high bar for this concept, because it's tougher than a website. It's more stringent. You have to pick. You kind of have to make your choice, and the temptation to do the traditional blast is so strong. And I think we also came up with some distinctions between B2B and B2C still, which of course is blasphemy to some. But I still think that distinction matters a little bit. Now, you could break it down and say this is more about complex sales versus non-complex sales. And I've had that argument with B2C and B2B lines are blurring advocates. And I accept that to some extent, right? Like, so home buying is a complex sale that might resemble more, B2B purchases, whereas, you could buy some B2B software on a credit card and that's fine. So the whole point is that we're kind of using those as placeholders, but I do think there is a distinction in terms of like what is the cost of alienating, the percentage of people that don't like your attempts, like that when that gets factored in, it's usually a more complex purchase with more influencers involved, and that's kind of what we were addressing today. Did you have anything you think we missed on this? This was a pretty thorough discussion.
No, this was quite thorough and probably needs to be continued using different channels and probably with an outlook on how to do it. So we are great at, nailing the problem. We have a couple of ideas how it could be better and how we would be doing it better.
Right.
And it's probably would be a constructive discussion also with Brian, Sam, and a couple of Tracy, McBear, for example, with a couple of other people, and how to address this in a way to come away from the inherent distrust to become trusted. Not that the marketing person is the next one that gets ignored after the salesperson, but I only need to get the document that I need to sign. And even that, in times of DocuSign, not really.
For those who want another angle on this, Barb wrote an interesting article on Diginomica, Can AI Really Drive the Success of Email Marketing? And I think one of the interesting things that comes out of that piece is there is a lot of data that's been compiled on this, and that's probably worthy of further crunching. But one thing is this notion that it is possible technically to create quote unquote millions of email campaigns, or that now I do want to caution though that when people say that, generative technology is more expensive. So when we say that, we have to take into account that our ROI analysis has to be adjusted accordingly, right? Because one of the reasons why people like these traditional spray and pray techniques so much is that the incremental costs of email at scale are just minor, These generative things are expensive. So that is going to be subject to some scrutiny, but just because you create millions of campaigns doesn't mean you're creating millions of new content pieces for the mediocre reasons we described. In fact, in my view, what it would be you might create a ton of different campaigns, maybe not millions, okay? But you figure out how many different campaigns, but it would draw on a more core set of content that had already been created that is linked to the preferences of those users. And I think that to me is viable. If you're going to tell me though that you're going to create millions of different content messages for people, I call BS. I don't think we're there yet. I don't see it. Do you?
No, and I don't think that there is a need to.
Right. It's not necessary even. If as we discussed, if you understand the preferences of your users, and if they have opted in to share that, and if you have an adequate content engine inside of your company that creates authoritative and useful and helpful content based on what you're good at, you shouldn't need to create unique friggin' content by a robot for every email. You have the content. It's a matter of placing it in the proper context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, as one of the content comments, oh my God, need more coffee. As one of the comments said earlier, context matters.
Yes.
That's the guardrail that is most helpful. Use context where available. And if you don't have context and cannot establish one, don't. Then just don't send it.
And in the new year, or maybe at the end of this year, I'm going to write a piece that kind of follows on to these conversations, but I'm going to focus specifically on how, Brent, I don't know if you're still in the chat, you may be on your show now, of how Brent and Paul from CRM Players got me to rethink a little bit this relevance versus entertainment thing, and why I think B2B brands can compete on relevance, but that there is an interesting element of entertainment and authenticity that can come out of that engages users that doesn't require massive budgets. It just requires a different way of thinking about content that frankly is more about sharing more unfiltered, more open discussions, albeit curated by well-trained people inside your organization who are good at that, versus spending huge amounts of money over prepping and over rehearsing messaging that comes off bland and stale. And so my message to B2B brands is you can compete on relevance, but you need to rethink this whole overproduction thing, which is not to say that production values don't play some of a role, because it does, and we could have a whole nother show on that topic. But like, I've been through so many things with brands where it's like, okay, let's schedule 3 rehearsals leading up to this webinar. And I'm always like, we don't need 3 rehearsals. We don't even need 1. Like, we need a sound check beforehand and let's let it rip. We all know each other, like, and so I think some of that is just creating hurdles and diluting messaging to the point where by the time the content is edited and handed around to so many people, it comes out like stale. And even though the content was once relevant and interesting, and it looks worse than a lot of stuff that AI would do by the time the brands are done with it. And it's like, oh my God. Tracy, thanks a lot for coming. Always love seeing you in the chat. Have a great holidays if I don't see you. I might be doing a show next week with Brian on the predictions. We're having some back and forth on that. Would love to have you next Friday if we end up doing that. But have a great holiday season, and we're just about to wrap here too. Thomas, final words?
As a close, so relevance is important. Very important. I do think that there's one more dimension that vendors should look at a bit more, which is emotion. So right. Because even a relevant message is not necessarily a differentiator. So I've been to, you and I both, and a couple of others too, have been to bunches of vendor briefings. And some of them with relevant messages could have just been presented by a competitor of theirs to get the S's right. Just change the logo on it. So at that point, this is in saturated markets, this may very well happen. That the relevance is equally distributed across vendors. Then it is important to also get the heart. Means
yes,
they need to cover positive emotions.
Right. And I will get to that in just a sec. I want to get to Brian's comment. Content, especially tech content, has a remarkably short half-life. Yes, it does. And Brian, unfortunately, it's become increasingly the case, like in kind of a sad way, because we have a lot of great posts on Diginomica that are years old now. One of my favorite posts is on value productivity versus task productivity, which I wrote in 2013. Is still one of my favorite posts that I ever wrote. It doesn't get any love from organic search, even though it's still relevant. And so, yeah, especially today, like it's always the new, and you got to keep feeding the beast. And but a couple of the key points that I would make there is that content has a short shelf life, but it should emanate from, in a B2B context, it should emanate from your core passions / expertise / things that you care about. So, for example, Brian, you write about various things around, how enterprises should address AI from a vendor evaluation perspective, or you write about, modern ERP versus crap ERP or whatever. Like, these are topics you write about all the time. Like, so the content might have a short shelf life, but your expertise has a long shelf life, and the content should emanate from that. And that's sort of the point. And it, in some cases it will be very snackable, but my big thing is that the most resonant B2B content might be snackable at times. Like you created like this from when I crashed your last show, you created this little soundbite of me going off for and you created a few really good sound bites from that show. But I was urging people to watch the whole discussion, because it was like, okay, the soundbite's fun, but it was actually the meat of the discussion that I thought was more important. And so for people who really want to resonate with decision makers and for brands that want to resonate with individuals, I would suggest that behind your snackable stuff is a much deeper methodology that's based on all the projects you've seen, all the things that went well, all the things that went wrong, all the lessons you've learned over the years, all of that stuff. maybe you've written a book about it, maybe you haven't, but the point is you have this whole method around that, a framework that you keep coming back to and updating. And then all your sound bites emanate from this core. And I think that's what really matters there. And Brian, you like chewy? Yeah. I like a little chewy video snack. Absolutely. Something, a little beef jerky, a little I don't know, a little meat on the bone there. I don't know. So Thomas, just I want to get back to your final point around like that it's not just relevance. And I think that's why I realized that I'm going to bring entertainment back into it again. So for lack of a better word, I'm going to use that for some of this stuff around like that like, so if a brand holds a so-called relevant thing, let's say it's about their AI plans and you and I perceive that as relevant. Well, what's going to be more interesting? Them just showing, roadmap slides and their vision and all that stuff, or if they start asking questions from the very beginning. And so part of it is interactive, right? Like pulling people in so that, why did I show up here? I showed up here to engage with you, not just to listen to you in a passive way, because otherwise maybe I'll just view that on replay later. So that's one thing. Yeah. But also from a speaking standpoint, like you said, like you can open up and you can be more human about what you're doing. And that can be a hook for people to understand what you're getting at. The last time I was on Disrupt TV, I kind of opened up around how disruptive AI has been to my career in both good and bad ways. And I kind of got personal about that. And I heard back later that ended up resonating with people because I kind of, instead of coming off as like this, oh, I know all this stuff, I'm this dude that knows all this shit, I was kind of like, no, this knocked me on my ass and here's what I'm trying to do about it. Mm-hmm. And so I think like that kind of openness is also part, right, of what you're describing. It's going about relevant content, but in a engaging way, I guess you could say, in a more human way.
Which is yet another dimension. So yes, those briefings better are not, monologues, but, they should be dialogues, simple as, yeah. And more vendors, to their credit, are recognizing this. But what I meant with the emotions part is that as a vendor, it is interesting. I don't say important yet, but because I haven't fully grasped it myself. It seems to be interesting to connect your brand with some positive emotions on a longer trajectory, which makes you sticky. The connection between to an emotion makes it sticky. Hypothesis. That's my hypothesis. It seems to work very well. Trenchant. It seems
Brian
to work very well.
Brian's been giving me a hard time about Trenchant anyway, but we'll get back to that anyway. So it seems to work very well for
some brands that are successfully riding on being connected to something that people, to a positive emotion, simple as.
Can you just give us one quick example of that?
The word fresh.
Fresh. Okay.
For example, yeah, which is this directly connects to, we are not doing it the old dusty, rusty way, but in a way that is more modern, more suited for current times. And it's eternal, basically. It won't change unless you stop following that message that you are giving by connecting yourself to that word. And this seems to be, there are some other brands that connected themselves to something, to a bit more technocratic ways, more to the other side of the brain, basically, yeah? To the analytic side of the brain, which doesn't seem to work that well.
There you go. And Brian says trenchant insights. Man, Brian, I'm glad I achieved something trenchant before this broadcast was over. Brian mocked me for my use of the word trenchant in this year's Unpredictions, which you can see on Diginomica. And like I said, we might be doing a show on this predictions.
They're already out, so I missed out.
yeah, check it out. They're up,
Well,
and we might be doing a show on predictions next week. In which case, you can let us know, Thomas, what your own predictions are for next year. And I will close by saying this interesting B2C thing. We didn't talk about B2C that much, but on the B2C side, I'm fascinated by how powerful a good loyalty program is, and how like I care so much more about that than personalization. And but it strikes me that if you had a great loyalty program, a kick-ass one, that personalization would start to emanate from that over time. But like Starbucks loyalty program, gives me what I need. It's absolutely amazing to be in a crowded airport and like type in like my order, and there's a line of like 50 people, and I go run an errand and I come back and grab my coffee in between flights. I mean, that's unbelievable, and that's all about like the app and the loyalty, and it's all built in. No hyper-personalization needed, but could they eventually personalize on top of that? Probably. They have the raw materials. So I think a lot of times in the age of AI, we're overlooking the beauty of what can be done with the raw materials, and we're trying to accelerate towards a climax of automagical wonderfulness that isn't there. And that's kind of where I stand right now. You?
I wouldn't call that even loyalty marketing, or this is just plain old. In other areas, you call that e-commerce, right?
But I get free stuff, and the point is, I'm like engaged around all of that. Like,
yeah,
I'm.
Well, it's not about the coffee, so that's just.
It's not about the
e-commerce.
coffee.
That's just e-commerce, and if the other 200 inhabitants of the tube that you just left do the same, then you're waiting.
Okay, we're an hour and 20 minutes in. I'm not going to argue about the definition of loyalty programs with you right now. I'm calling it a loyalty program. You can beg to differ. The point is, build that stuff first, and then maybe your AI will actually have something it can use. I know that's a shocking assertion.
Make the customer happy. That's basically
there. You go. All right. We actually agreed. Okay, cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. Great to see you. That's it. Thanks for taking this discussion as far as we could today. Pleasure to have you. Bye.
See you.